Hello, 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 and welcome back to another episode of Bento Bureau, the show where we talk about Japan from an international perspective. I'm your host, Basim Hijazi, or Buzz for short, and with me, as always, my fellow co host and productivity guru, who has been particularly active on Clubhouse lately, Mr. Bastian Harth. How are you doing, sir?
Hello, hello, hello. I'm doing well. How are you doing, Buzz?
I'm doing all right.
Glad to hear that. Who do we have with us today? Tell me. I'm quite
Glad you
excited.
asked, Bastian. You know what, Bastian? Do you remember back in 2014 when we first came to live in Japan? My experience was, exciting, albeit a little frustrating at times, and I think that's because of some of the cultural differences one needs to learn and get used to, especially, in my case, where it was the first time I was living abroad alone. We basically had to do a lot of research and asking questions in order to really understand how things work and how to behave in certain situations. Even in work, for instance, life. Don't you kind of wish that there was something that, could have helped us understand those things faster when we lived abroad for the first year?
Yeah, I do believe so. I would love to have had some help, to be honest, because I think it was a very difficult time to adjust to a new culture, adapting to a new life, going abroad, leaving your family and friends behind almost. It would have been nice to have some help from time to time.
Yeah, I mean, it was my first time living abroad, so I mean, and Japan, I imagine comparatively speaking, if I went to the United States or the UK, I would say it was a more difficult experience, even though I haven't had the experience of living in the US. I would say it was more difficult, I imagine, I would
Mm.
only imagine. But today, in order to answer that question, we've got a very special guest joining us who happens to know exactly what we needed back then, you know, and definitely what a lot of people coming to Japan for the first time can actually benefit from. Ladies and gentlemen, let me switch to the grid here. And it is our pleasure to introduce today's guest, cross cultural trainer, coach, and content writer, among many other specialties, and founder of Thrive Tokyo, Katheryn Gronauer. Welcome to Bento Bureau.
Hey, you guys, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Katheryn. It's great to have you on today. You're half Japanese and half American, and you were raised between Florida and Tokyo throughout your life. Which place do you feel closer to or identify with more?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think at this point in my life, I've literally spent 50% of my time in both locations. But I would say that my childhood, I would say I probably spent a little bit more time in the States than I did in Japan. So I primarily came to Japan for the full summer vacations. And I also came to Japan for elementary school as well. But the rest of my education and kind of upbringing happened in the States. So I think that a lot of the things that form when you're being raised and your identity and things like that kind of happen a lot when you're in childhood. So I would say I kind of lean a little bit more to being more American, I would say, than being Japanese. But I've spent my entire adult life living in Japan, so I definitely feel that Japan is more like home at this point.
How long have you been living now in Japan, if I may ask?
It's been about 12 years now.
Okay,
12 years now officially. Yeah.
that's a long time. Buzz and I, we have only been a couple of years in Japan, but 12 years, that's long. Can I ask you, you've been raised between two cultures, and even though you lived in America and kind of identify a little bit more with American culture, was there ever a time where you said, "Oh, this is so weird that, these like the American culture, the Japanese culture are kind of clashing here?"
I think that when I was growing up, I kind of noticed that things were different, but I wasn't really understanding how it was affecting really. So I just have a lot of memories of growing up and having my Japanese aunts and my Japanese grandfather kind of making sure that they were correcting a lot of the things that I wasn't doing that were socially appropriate in Japan. But then I would go back to the States and then I would have the opposite experience where people are trying to tell me to open up and be more confident and be more outspoken and those types of qualities. So it was definitely kind of confusing to go back and forth between the two. but I don't think I really realized like or pinpointed what those things actually were until I started doing cross-cultural training myself in my adult life. So yeah, it's been interesting trying to reflect on my own upbringing through helping other people with cultural assimilation in Japan.
Mhm. So a
I
cross-cultural trainer. What is a cross-cultural trainer? What do you do exactly?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, it's funny. I had a guy ask me, he said, "So, Catherine, who are you?" It wasn't like, "So, who are you?" Like, tell us about yourself. It was like, "Who are you?" And I was like, I do so many different things. Sometimes I'm helping people with orientation. So, like, understanding how to live in Japan and like do your daily routines and, grocery shopping, just like really basic things and developing a routine. And then other times I'm helping people with the cross cultural training, which is essentially helping people understand how Japanese people think and how those thought processes affect how people work and behave in the workplace. And then beyond that, I also do some help with coaching as well. So it took me a really long time to realize that the one word that kind of encompasses all the things I do is onboarding. So I would say
Mm.
that I onboard people to living in Japan. So in the early stages, that could be orientation. And then a little bit after orientation, it would be cross cultural training. And then beyond that, if they've been here for a year, 2 years, and they're starting to develop feelings of, culture shock and, trying to feel like they're living their best life in Japan, then things like the coaching come into play. But to answer your first question, which is what is cross cultural training, it's basically being able to kind of pinpoint the key differences between how people think and behave in different cultures and how those differences might actually affect your experience in the workplace. So, you might be part of a company where, let's say, you're working for a global company and you've been working in an office outside of Japan. But then you come to Japan, and even though the work and the goals are the same, the procedure that people are going through to meet those goals might be very different, and the communication style might be very different. And sometimes those things can cause confusion, and it can also cause some type of frustration, or in some cases, like, you can notice things are different but you don't really understand the why. And those are the things that we essentially go into, is just trying to pinpoint what those core values are, and things that you can do to help bridge gaps, and just understand more about yourself and your own personal views on culture.
Mm.
Would you say the cultural dimensions between the United States and Japan, of course, they're quite distinguishable, I would imagine, but would you say the United States has a distinctive like approach to, cultural interactions in the workplace and lifestyle? Because they always describe the United States as a sort of melting pot of culture, right? So I'm really interested in your experience. How would you compare those two countries in terms of those approaches to cultural dimensions?
Mm.
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I think one of the primary differences between a place like America and Japan is that, America has a lot of diversity and Japan is more homogeneous. And so just things like the demographic really affects how people interact with each other. It's a lot easier to have indirect forms of communication when you're in a homogeneous society. You can, because everybody's behaving and using their body language and nuances in the same way, there isn't really any, confusion around the communication. But the more diverse a culture is, the more likely you're going to use direct forms of communication, like verbal language. And we really see that in the United States. It's really important that people are very, straightforward, or they're very transparent or with how they use their verbal language. And that's something that's tends to be pretty essential when you have people who are coming from many different cultural backgrounds, because being able to use your verbal language in a direct way helps make sure that everybody's on the same page when they have different thought processes and behaviors. So yeah, I would say like those, there's definitely some big differences, and I would say diversity, as you mentioned, is definitely one of the key underlying factors of that.
Hmm.
And maybe relating to that, what are these kind of cultural challenges that people face, that who you coach? Do you have
Mhm.
some examples?
Oh, okay. So do you mean like in the workplace
Mhm.
specifically? Yeah, so
Yes.
I would say like definitely communication is definitely the first one. So some things that you hear, oh, it's interesting. I can think of probably at least one for every dimension. But um, if someone is in a management position, one thing that I hear a lot is that their subordinates, they think that their subordinates, their Japanese subordinates, are really like weak or lack confidence. That's something that I hear a lot. It's like, oh, they're not confident enough. And I'm like, what, why do you think they're not confident? They're like, oh, well, either they're asking me too many questions, they're like asking me for approval, they're not taking initiative or ownership over their own work. And, it just kind of leaves the impression that this person doesn't know how to think for themselves or, resolve issues.
Mm.
So that can be one, and that's typically related to things like, collectivism versus individualism. So you might come from a culture where you think people should just make their own decisions and be in charge of a project, whereas in Japan, people might care more about having, other people as part of the decision making process. So it's really important to keep other people looped into that. But it's interesting to hear people make assumptions or jump to conclusions that a person is lacking confidence because they're asking a question. I find that really interesting because I think when you go to a place where you don't understand how people are acting, you're making assumptions about them based on your own cultural experiences.
Mm.
So, if I was in America and someone kept asking me questions and wasn't making a decision, I can assume that the reason must be because they're lacking confidence. That might make sense in that context. But in the context over here, that's not necessarily the case.
Mhm.
I just went off a little bit on that, but there's, some other things I would say that people have experienced are, going to meetings and, maybe giving a presentation. And at the end, you say, hey, so does anybody have any thoughts? And then it's like so silent.
Yeah.
Nobody, nobody's voicing their opinion. Nobody is, asking questions or, in some cases you might be giving a presentation and, there's some people in the back row who are sleeping like this, closing their eyes. They just completely look disengaged. And I think what's interesting about that is, people who aren't from Japan, it's for some reason brings about a lot of anxiety. Like just hearing that silence for like a very long pause, I think people start to think, oh no, like, did they not understand my presentation? Is there, you know, or they might just think that people have no ideas and, they're not innovative or, something like that. So definitely like procedures related to meeting styles, I think is another big thing. I had one woman said to me, she was like a leader for marketing and one of the marketing teams. And she could see that some of the people in her team were having meetings without her. And so she said, "Oh no, like why are they having meetings without me? I need to be part of this decision-making process and they're intentionally leaving me out." And she was feeling really lonely, but we have no idea what they were having a conversation about. They could have been talking about what you want to have for lunch day or something, but there was just this visual of seeing people going into a meeting without her. It really made her feel like she wasn't being included in a lot of the things. But sometimes those things just have to do with how people are communicating or how they have meeting styles, and things like that. But I feel like I can think of a handful of other things too, but those are the first ones that come to my mind. Is
Mm.
there anything that comes up for you guys when you hear these?
No, that's really interesting. There's a lot to unpack with what you just said. So just going back to what you mentioned about communication in particular, and like with certain people in certain contexts, they can't identify, when someone just has a different approach based on, their background to like certain environments at work, with communication, and they just make assumptions, such as, they're not confident. That's something I've really not thought of personally. Actually, I haven't really thought about it, but now that I think about it, as someone who has grew up in different cultures throughout my life, I grew up in the UK and I live in Qatar in the Middle East, and I studied in Japan. Now that you mentioned that, it's a really good point. Actually, it's do you think that being someone from, identifying with multiple cultures or multiple backgrounds, do you think that you're, especially equipped to kind of identify, when in those certain contexts, when a certain person from a different country or a different background comes in and, they haven't grasped how things work or operate culturally in this environment yet, versus if they're lacking confidence and so forth.
Yeah,
Hmm.
I think probably one of the hardest things, kind of coming out of your comments is that it's really hard to know if the person you are interacting with is the one who is lacking confidence or doing something, or if it's a general cultural thing. So sometimes people might not actually know if it's a culture related thing unless they see it as a pattern happening with other people in their office. So if you're only interacting with one person and you see it happening, it's really hard to decipher, okay, is this just this person's style, or is this actually like a
Hmm.
general cultural thing? I think that's something that's really hard for people. And yeah, when I hear people talk, I think I can think in my head like all these other reasons, which might be underlying reasons why people act certain ways. But I think one of the things that's the hardest for me is that when I meet people and they're in a state of being frustrated, they're usually not ready to be coached or trained yet, because they think that their way is the right way.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
so there's kind of like this progression that people go through when they're living in Japan. And initially it's like, oh wow, Japan's great, everybody's so polite, this is really nice. And then all of a sudden it's like, okay, I see a whole bunch of procedures that I need to fix because it would be so much more efficient if we did it X, Y, and Z way. So they start to pitch it, and then it falls on deaf ears, and then eventually the next stage is some sort of frustration, like, oh, nobody listens to my ideas, oh, nobody does this, people are lacking confidence, and it's kind of very like a them versus me type of
Hmm.
scenario. And whenever, yeah, if I meet people at that particular point, they're usually not ready to kind of recognize, okay, maybe there's actually more things that are happening here, so I have to kind of wait a little bit until they get to a point where they think, oh, maybe I can actually just learn about culture, and then it becomes easier to kind of have those conversations and help them reflect on certain situations that they've observed or experienced.
So that is the last stage, basically, when they have become open-minded and actually want to learn and embrace the changes or the things around them.
Yeah, exactly. So I think like ideally if everybody could have some sort of, coaching over the course of time, then you can really help people either prevent those situations or address them when it actually happens. But the people who have reached out to me, they're usually people who have been here for like 3 to 4 years, who
Hmm.
have gone through the process of trying to fix it themselves, make assumptions themselves, figure it out themselves, and then they realize, okay, maybe I actually need to figure out what these gaps might actually be.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Is there also the language, the Japanese language part of that? Is that a huge challenge for people?
Definitely. I think it's a challenge on both sides. So there's the thing about language is, just because you can speak a language doesn't mean that how you are speaking is the correct method of communication. So I heard a guy say this once. I wish I remember who it was because it was such a great quote that he said. He said that learning a language is like learning how to drive a car. Like you're learning how the car functions and how to actually drive it. But learning about culture is like learning the rules of the road.
Hmm.
So, for example, if you learn how to drive a car, but then you don't know that you're supposed to drive on the other side of the street compared to your own the street that you drive on in your own culture, that's good. That's kind of a problem. So, you can see like people who are new to Japan trying to communicate in Japanese, or you hear Japanese people trying to communicate in English, but the way that they're trying to say something, they're basically directly translating what they're trying to say, and what they mean behind the words might actually be a bit different. So, to give you an example, it could be something like, if a Japanese person says, "Oh, I think that might be difficult," that's pretty much they're saying no. But if you think in Japanese, muzukashii desu ne, like the word muzukashii is basically their way of saying it's difficult or no. But the direct translation isn't really telling someone from another culture that it's a no. Typically what would happen is someone from another culture hearing that in English, like it would be difficult, they start to
Yeah.
look for solutions. Like, oh, can we try it this way? Okay, it's difficult for here, but maybe if we did it this way, if we did it that way, and it just kind of goes down into this, rabbit hole of not really getting anywhere. And then you see the Japanese person getting a little bit more uncomfortable. Like, I'm trying to tell this person we can't do it. And then you have the person on the other side saying, I'm trying to come up with solutions, but they're not being responsive. So yeah, I'd say that's probably the role that language plays. It's important to be able to have language under your belt, but it might not necessarily. You need to have both. You need to learn about the language, but you also need to learn about how things are communicated.
Right.
Yeah.
You can have like a very high proficiency in a language, but it doesn't allow you to understand the culture if you're not open-minded enough, right? Well,
Exactly.
it gives you the option basically to be open-minded for the culture and learn more about it.
Yeah.
Gives you the tools, maybe.
Thank you. Yes, I was
yeah.
looking for the words here.
Katheryn, going back to that, actually, from a personal point of view, you grew up in both of these countries. So, did you ever experience those challenges yourself as a half Japanese person? Like when you came to live in Japan certain times, did you ever face those frustrations coming from an American, kind of cultural upbringing? And how did you overcome, those notions in your head that you had about how things work in a Japanese cultural context?
I gotta say, I think I can see how difficult it is for people who are, not Japanese to come live here, because um I can understand Japanese people more when they speak in Japanese. But when they're speaking in English, when we're communicating in English, I feel like my brain and my mannerisms are thinking more in an American style. But then if we switch to Japanese, then all of a sudden I feel like we understand each other culturally better. But my experience of coming to Japan is I made a lot of cultural faux pas, is what we call them. Like, I made some cultural mistakes myself. And I think it's because, up until coming to live here as an adult, I had only ever been really visiting or living here as a child. And so there were some things, like even just, like recycling and like trash separation, that I didn't even know because I hadn't really done it when I was growing up here. So
We all
I remember,
relate.
yeah, yeah. So, I remember I was living in a shared apartment with Japanese women, and there was this one woman who was just really passive aggressive, and not passive aggressive per se, but maybe just passive. Like, I could tell that she didn't want to really engage with me, but I wasn't really sure why. And I think that's one of the interesting things about Japan, is that people kind of they interact with you in a polite way on the surface, but if they don't want to engage with you, like you can really feel it. Like you feel it in the air. And it was the type of situation where I could tell something was wrong, but I didn't know if I should ask her about it or not, because, I just couldn't really guess like what the situation could be. And it turned out, after a year of living together, she moved out. And I found out from the other people in the space, they said, hey, actually, you weren't removing the labels from the PET bottles, the plastic bottles, when you were recycling them. And so she was getting really irritated about that. And every time you took out the trash, she would actually follow you down and wait until you left, and then like separate the trash the way it was supposed to be. And I was thinking to myself, like, this is a situation that happens a lot with, the other foreigners who come to Japan, where they're just like, why couldn't you just say something? Like, just like we just, missed out on a year of a relationship over something like, trash separation. Why couldn't she point it out? And I was really thinking about this situation and kind of wondering, like, from her angle and from different angles, like what could have been done differently. And if you think about it, something like just trash separation, I don't think people really think about that as a cultural thing, even though it is and it can be. So, if I was living here in Japan and a foreigner came, I know that I should tell them to take off their shoes when they enter a house, or this is how you exchange a meishi, a business card, or, there's things that are like very obvious that they're things that happen in Japan, and people know that foreigners are not going to be accustomed to that. And it's okay because they can guide them through it. But something like trash separation, like that's not really something people think is unique to Japan per se. It's kind of like if I was in the States and I saw someone littering on the ground, I'd be like, "Ugh, like, what is this person doing?" But maybe they litter in their country and that's the norm. I don't know. So it's kind of an awkward thing to point out when you can't really pinpoint if it's cultural or not. And I think that's actually why the reason why working in Japan or doing, multicultural teams in Japan, it's so hard to understand when you're working with people, because you can't really pinpoint what is a culture related issue versus what is something that's happening with that individual. So um yeah, I actually forgot what your original question was, but
I find
you
that very extreme, to be honest. I've never heard anyone following one down to separate the trash for them.
yeah,
It's crazy.
I know it kind of gave me the creeps thinking that she was like peeking around the corner and like seeing how I was, at least I was putting the items in the right, bins where they needed to be. But she still kind of came down there afterwards and like removed the labels and separated them. So
Yeah.
I can't, I mean, that is very, I mean, how do you learn that as a foreigner, as someone who's not from the country, right? If no one tells you, so like this, I mean, yes, you can kind of like,
yeah,
you like this
the
passive,
answers are
there's this certain passive aggressiveness, as you said, and you can kind of hear it in the undertone, but still sometimes people like "kuki ga yominai ne?" Like this is kind of a typical way of saying that the person
Read the
doesn't
room.
understand, read the room, thanks,
Yeah.
yeah. But it can be very tough for a lot of people. You can't read the room all the time. And yes, the obvious things like, taking off your shoes, or bowing, for example, instead of handshaking, those are kind of obvious things, I guess, a
yeah.
person kind of knows when they come to Japan, or at least should know.
Mhm.
Uh, Even that can be challenges, but like the tiny little details, the nitty gritty, that can be just something you learn over time. But if no one tells you, that's
Do
tough.
Yeah,
do you think do you think having a high level emotional intelligence actually gives you like an added advantage over the living in Japan? Because you kind of observe people's behaviors more closely, and if someone who doesn't particularly observe those things too closely, they might struggle more.
that's a really good question. I'm actually not completely sure. I do think that maybe people who are used to kind of observing things before they take action, I think that that can really be something that people can use to their advantage. But I think that culture is about conditioning. It's like behavioral conditioning. So, you know, just because I have a higher level, I might have a higher level of sensitivity having been in Japan and learning about reading the air compared to someone who's maybe from America. When I'm in America and I'm with Americans, I don't necessarily turn that on when I'm there because the tendency is to behave a certain way when you are with a set of Americans. So um, yeah, I mean, maybe it could be helpful, but I still think that there needs to be some like tangible, ideas or concepts that people can kind of understand when they're going into it beyond just like
Mm.
being observational. Yeah.
You know, I was very surprised, but I had to say that was a very good question.
I mean,
Something I haven't thought of.
I just thought about it, and for some reason, I started thinking maybe Japanese people just naturally have high level emotional intelligence, but then I don't want to generalize that, you know. But I just always, yeah, that came to my mind, and I thought that would be very interesting actually to if there's a study that compares that to somehow, I don't know, or something that kind of dissects that in further detail. That'd be really interesting to
That would
talk
be really
about.
interesting. Yeah, I'd be curious about that.
Me too.
So, Katheryn, we touched upon it just a couple of minutes ago, but you know, Bastian was asking how does one, you know, excluding high level emotional intelligence, let's say, kind of overcome these challenges? And you pointed to yourself, and you're the founder, you kind of went ahead and founded something that helps people with these sorts of issues, Thrive Tokyo. You want to tell us a bit more about that and why you decided to found that organization?
Yeah, so let me just answer the first part, which is I think people don't know what they don't know, and I think that's actually probably the biggest handicap that they're going to have when they come here. So you know, it's just something that needs to be pointed out beforehand, and you could learn about it after the fact, but I think trying to rely on having other people point things out to you all the time is probably not the best way to go about things. I would assume if I moved to another country that people would point certain things out, but I think that there's just going to be some scenarios you're in where people don't even recognize that they need to share something with you. So yeah, it would definitely be helpful to have that. But yeah, so about Thrive Tokyo. So again, I just do a combination of orientation programs, cross-cultural training, and also coaching. And a better way to encompass that would just be to say that I help with onboarding. And I started my business actually because I wanted to be a health coach. So I had a completely different brand, and I was going to help people primarily with weight loss because I had lost about 20 kilos when I came to Japan, learning about Eastern and Western ways of thinking about health and nutrition. And that was something I was really passionate about. I really wanted to help people just think about, their lifestyle in a different way. But in the process of starting that, I realized that a lot of the people I was interacting with didn't know how to shop in a grocery store. And
Mhm.
so I was like, okay, this is more of a fundamental problem here. Like, you need to know like what is milk and what is drinkable yogurt before we can even talk about like how to eat healthy in another country. And so, yeah, I just started, offering things like, here, I'll just take you through the grocery store so you just know what it is. Or if you're someone who's vegan or you're into ketogenic diet or whatever it is, let me just like help point you to where you can actually find the resources that you need. And I was really surprised to find that there was more people asking for more about that info than they were specifically about like just general, health and nutrition. And so I was like, okay, maybe there's something here. Maybe I can, uh, just help people kind of bring them up to speed. I think I might have mentioned this before to you when we were chatting earlier, but I like to call it adulting. So it's like you're relearning how to do all the things that you used to be able to do on autopilot as an adult in your home country. So things like just doing your laundry or doing your shopping or, building your routine, like finding the exercise facility that you like to use, like just those little things, just trying to help them get set up. That was kind of like the next progression that I was helping people with. And then that also segued into helping with cross cultural training. So essentially, when I was helping people with coaching in the early stage of my business, I was hearing a lot of things related to like, oh, I can't find my purpose in Japan, or I'm having issues related to work and I don't know what people are thinking. And so essentially, I just started kind of pivoting my business to make sure that I could address those different areas that people were having challenges around.
That was actually one of my questions. Why you changed from health to
I know,
basically
right?
coaching?
Yeah, I gotta tell you, like, if I could do it all over again, like, I wish that I could just pick like one thing and stick with it, because building a business, it really takes time. No matter what thing that you're focusing on, there's going to be time that needs to happen to realize those certain goals. So I wish that I could have just picked health and kind of like run with it, but I think in some ways the business that I have now is in a much better place to kind of help people with a variety of issues that are always happening over the at least the first 6 months to maybe 12 months of their stay. And yeah, it's just been really interesting to help people with different areas.
I would actually I wasn't quite sure which question to ask first, but I'll stay with Thrive Tokyo. I love the
Sure.
name, by the way.
Yeah.
Who are your clients?
Mhm.
Are those companies? Are those like individuals? How
Yeah.
do you find the
So
connections with them?
Sure. So I do a combination of both B2B and B2C. So I do have clients that are corporate clients, and I will go to their corporation and I'll do training. And right now, I would say like some of my bigger clients are ones that are probably more tech oriented. So these are companies that are hiring a lot of people who have a certain skill set from outside of Japan, and they're bringing them here. So that they're not necessarily expats, like they're not transferring internally from one location to the other, but they're actually being hired just from abroad, and they might actually be in Japan for longer than a fixed contract. So yeah, so some of the people I've been helping, I would say, are probably in the tech industry. That seems to be kind of the majority. But I also do B2C work as well, and the people who I've interacted with, they're from very different backgrounds. But I would say primarily professionals who are working here. But depending on the organization I've worked with, I would say that the end user has had very different backgrounds. So sometimes the end user is, an international school teacher, or maybe the end user is someone who is, an intern who has come here for a 3-month internship program or something like that. So I've really been able to connect with people from different walks of life. And that has also been interesting too, because at each stage of someone's life, they have different things that they're looking to solve. But yeah, in a nutshell, though, I would say the primary B2C people I work with are professionals, and they're typically in like upper management positions.
I love that. I find it so fascinating.
Now it's interesting you mention tech companies as one of your main like
Yeah.
B2B clients, because we've had a couple of founders and individuals involved with coding camps, programming camps, and tech companies on the show in the past. So it would be like one of the things that these companies mentioned part of their code camps, and I thought I might get your input on this, is they always mention how you do not need Japanese to kind of succeed in the Japanese tech industry. You do not need to know Japanese, you just need to know the skills and how to present yourself. So
Mhm.
I was wondering if that's something you agree with. Is it more important, like at least in the tech industry, to kind of know how to understand those cultural dimensions per se, but is language as a requirement as part of that?
So, the tech industry is interesting because it's probably one of the few industries that people can come to Japan without any previous like Japanese knowledge. So I would say, the short answer is yes, you can come to Japan without speaking Japanese and be able to work here, because as long as you understand the coding language, that's what you're hired to do. Um, and I think one of the benefits of being in the tech industry is that even the Japanese people who are in the tech industry, they kind of have a similar process of doing I guess what you could say, the agile process of innovation. So, testing a product and then or testing a software and then trying to, make improvements to it along the way, which is a concept in and of itself that's typically very different from Japanese culture. They usually like to have things that are very perfect and refined before they launch something. Whereas, in the tech industry, things are so rapidly changing that you need to kind of launch and then fix things
Yeah.
as they go. But having said that, I do think people really need to have some type of cross-cultural, you know, skill sets for two reasons. One is just because, the lifestyle in general, you need to learn how to live in Japan. Like that's kind of like a constant, no matter what industry you're in, is like just learning how to engage with people outside of the office. You need to have friends, outside too, or just things that you can do. Um, but just, internally, I think one thing people don't realize is that a lot of your clients are going to be Japanese. And, this is something that I mention to people who, I was working with a woman who's from an international bank, for example, and she's in a management director position. And it's like you can try to have an international, more multicultural way of communicating internally, but keep in mind that all of your external clients, they might have a very traditional way of functioning in their own companies. And you need to understand that, because that could put delays on, how you're doing your project. That could add, different layers to the procedures that are involved with, executing your project. So you still need to be culturally aware, even if you wind up working in a multicultural team. And one other thing I note too is that some people who come here and work in multicultural teams in tech, there's still potentially a very bureaucratic style, not management, but like accounting department or HR department that's in the Japanese company. So even in turn, like department to department could have different procedures too. So maybe on a day-to-day instance, I think people could probably be relatively fine working in tech, but I still think you need to be culturally aware if you're doing any cross-functional work, or if you need to do any liaising with, your HR or accounting or things like that.
Mhm.
Hmm.
I'm sitting here a bit mind blown, to be honest. It opens up a whole new world for me. Cross-cultural coaching. I find that amazing. Could I ask you? I was struggling to see which question I should ask first, but you mentioned earlier the dieting part, and you mentioned that there are differences between the West and the East. For us, that might be obvious, but maybe you can point out the differences a little bit.
From directing specifically?
From the dieting part, actually, between the
Oh, from dieting. Yeah. Okay.
yes, I wanted to insert that question earlier, but I wasn't quite sure if it fits or not, because I wanted to continue this conversation,
Sure.
but I wanted to ask.
Yeah. Let's talk about East-West nutrition here. So
Yes.
sure. So I would say probably the biggest difference I would say is in the West, a lot of things related to health are talked about from a scientific perspective. So, if I wanted to lose weight, the words that you would hear are things like protein, like make sure you get your protein, or, lower your carbs, or, count your calories. And all of these words and this lingo, it's not something anybody can like intuitively connect with. Like you need to go on to Google to be able to like search for how many calories are in your food, or how much your protein content is, or like you
Yeah.
need a calculator to make that happen.
Mhm.
And so I think some of the benefits of that is that you can get very specific information, and you can formulate, the exact, food that you would need to design your body a certain way. But I think that it's not really helping people develop habits that are helping them trust what their body needs, and developing a connection with their body. So you hear people say that they want to do like intuitive eating, and I thought that this word was interesting. Like, what is intuitive eating? So it's basically just like getting to a point where you can just eat when you're hungry, not eat when you're not hungry, and just trust that whatever you're craving is something that your body actually needs in that moment. But if you're focusing on calorie counting and protein counting and macros and all those things, it's really hard to be intuitive at the same time, because there's like this conflict between needing to fulfill some type of mathematical equation, but also just trying to listen to your body and your cravings and things like that. So I would say, like, when I was living in the States, I was really struggling because I felt like I was following all of the scientific methods I was hearing about, but I wasn't really seeing the results. And I also didn't feel like the foods that I was eating was really something I enjoyed or I connected with. So, coming to Japan, I thought what was interesting is if you look at Eastern holistic nutrition, a lot of the ways that they describe selecting foods that are the right for your or that are right for your body is thinking about things like things that you can actually feel, like body temperature. So, if I have ginger, I feel warm in my body. So, if it's, very cold outside, or, right now, like my hands are very cold, for example, if you have like poor circulation, you know that you can choose something like ginger to help your body with circulation. So that's kind of like an intuitive thing that I know to select because I know how my body feels based on, how I consume it. And I think the most interesting thing from learning Eastern nutrition when you come to Japan is Japan is really big on seasonality. And
Mm.
one of the key things about developing an intuitive way of eating or trusting your body is understanding that the foods that Mother Nature is providing you at different stages of the year and the seasons is probably going to be the superfood that you need to acclimate your body to your climate. So, from a scientific perspective, have you guys heard of things like superfoods?
I have, yes. No,
I
things
have not.
like natto essentially is considered a superfood, for instance. Like one of these
Oof.
foods that
Yeah,
are just
superfood.
chock filled with vitamins, right?
Yeah, lots of
Yeah.
so there's like a list of things that people consider to be superfoods, but
Mm.
some of them are like acai or, cacao or, coffee beans, even what's it called, chia seeds, these types of things. And if you think about it, a lot of those things that are like very nutrient dense, they actually come from very hot climates. So they're coming from areas like around the equator.
Mm.
So if you think about it, they're meant to provide your body with this very big punch of, energy and nutrition in a very hot location. Um, but the thing is, those types of foods don't exist if you're living in a very cold location. You need to import it to have it. And you might notice that eating, acai bowls in the middle of winter at a ski resort, it just doesn't feel good in your body, even
Yeah,
though
it's
it
a bit
might
of a
have a
weird
lot of
choice.
yeah, it's a really weird choice, and it's like, yeah, like from a nutritional perspective, it's considered healthy, but it doesn't really feel very grounding and warm in your body compared to having something like a vegetable stew or,
Mm.
whatever is, in your environment. So I think just trying to think about like thinking about your environment, thinking about just making better choices based on how you want to feel, instead of making them from like scientific purposes. I think that is what I found really interesting. And just one last thing, because I could literally talk about this for for so long.
Go ahead.
Yeah. If you think about it, foods that are grown in nature, they they grow from, how can I phrase this? Very high up in the sky, like let's say from trees, then you have bushes, then you have things that are growing down like root vegetables, right? So if you think about how foods grow, you have things that go very, very high up in the sky all the way down to things that grow very low down in root vegetables in the ground. And
Mm.
typically the higher up something grows, the more likely it's going to have very high water content, and a lot of hydration, and electrolytes and things that are going to keep your body very well hydrated. So think about things like coconuts. Like
Yeah.
coconuts grow very high up in the sky. So the higher up in the sky, closer to the sun it's getting, the more likely you're having high water content item, and it's going to keep your body acclimated to being in a very hot location. But then the colder the climate gets, the more likely you're going to have foods that are growing down into the ground, or root vegetables. These have lower um, concentrations of water content, because you don't want to be drinking so much water your body's getting cold, right? Like it's about keeping your body warm. And you're also going to have a lot more mineral content too, because it's growing in dirt. So things like this are really helping your body, like with your, what's the word? Like your muscles, and making sure that you're not feeling like fatigued, making sure that your digestive system is really good. And it's just basically, case in point, it's interesting to see how the direction that a food is growing is kind of correlated to where it's actually located, in terms of
Hmm.
hot climates and cold climates. And if you can just trust that whatever local foods you're eating during the time of the year is going to help your body adjust to your climate, you're going to be able to maintain a good balance of nutritional content, and also keeping your body um, healthy throughout the course of the year. So that was my very long way of saying
No, that
how
is
interesting I found
personally.
the nutrition. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that for me personally, that is incredibly fascinating. I love the idea of seasonality and kind of nature
Yeah.
dictating how at least Japanese people tend to view food and sustenance in general, and nutrition. That is super interesting, actually. I've never quite thought about it. I've
Yeah.
always had the impression of Japanese nutrition as just typically being less flexible, to be honest, as someone coming from the another country, and like having certain dietary requirements or habits. I always struggled at times with going to a restaurant, or finding food in a grocery store, just finding something that I'm looking for personally in terms of my allergies, for instance. I always
Mm.
felt like they're a bit vague with what kind of information they choose to present on products and in a restaurant, with that sort of thing. So I'm wondering, actually, with Thrive Tokyo, for instance, the people who come to you for support with life and going to a grocery store, for instance, do they kind of ask, is that a common question that comes up, and how do you help these people kind of navigate what they're looking for based on their dietary requirements or whatnot?
So you mean question, meaning like, do people ask about, food, like allergens and those types of things?
Yeah, for instance, like if they're coming to you and they're like, how do I know, if this thing has this specific product in it, and how do I know which one to get that's going to be safe for me to eat, or appropriate to
Yeah.
eat?
So in general, when people ask those questions, I usually direct them to the location where they can find the product they're looking for. So let's say, for example, you are gluten free. People who are gluten free, they can't have soy sauce, because soy sauce has some flour in it. So I would point them to a health food store that sells tamari soy sauce, which is basically one that's gluten free.
Hmm.
And yeah, I can direct people if they have allergies. I've had some people ask for things like little food cards, so that if they go to a restaurant, they can just show people, the things that they can't have. And they can basically make sure that the chef knows about it. um Also, one thing I find interesting is making something like a food card, for example. When I used to work in a concierge, which was before I started my business, I found it interesting that a lot of Japanese people don't understand the extent of allergies and, food intolerances and, dietary restrictions and things like that. So, for example, if you tell someone that you are lactose intolerant, they will ask you, "Can you have eggs?" And it's like, well, eggs are not really like, it's not milk product, but it is, because it's considered dairy, I guess. People start to get concerned about other things. And so just trying to make sure that the whatever letter or uh you know card that people are bringing actually details it in a way that gives comfort to the person who's reading it, not just saying like, oh, this person doesn't have milk, but I don't know how, or I don't know how to ask them if they can't have eggs either. So I try to like add in additional things like, don't worry, they can have this or they can have that, you know. So just trying to kind of like navigate those communication issues that might happen. Um, and also another thing I found interesting is, you know, something like tofu, for example. A lot of people assume that if they find a tofu hamburger, that it is vegetarian, and that's not necessarily the case. Like
Yeah.
there are some tofu hamburgers that have chicken in it, for example. It's like mixed, and I've had people be like, "How could they put chicken in a tofu burger?"
I'm one of
And
those
like, but
people.
yeah, so the thing is, in Japan, in Japan, tofu is just another food that people eat. You know, it's like if you're outside of Japan, the only people who eat tofu are people who are vegetarian. So the idea of
Yeah.
mixing tofu with meat just like doesn't even make any sense. But, you know, here tofu is just another food element that can be incorporated with other foods. So just because you find a tofu hamburger, it doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't have meat. Or it might not have meat, but that it might have things like fish stock or other, you know, uh, animal stock that has been used in making
Mm.
it. So I think like there's again, you know, this comes to the thing about the assumptions. People tend to make assumptions about things. That's where you really have to kind of point things out, so that they don't find out later that they were you know eating something that wasn't in alignment with their you know dietary goals.
Mm.
Yeah.
I'm a bit mind blown, to be honest. Like, I thought a tofu burger in Japan, since I never had it, is actually vegetarian. Okay, I've learned something new.
No,
Yeah.
they do that a lot. Yeah, they do mix a lot of foods, and my personal frustration with that is that when I look at a menu item and it says it is a specific thing, like let's say chicken or tofu, and then it ends up including something else along with it, like beef or pork or something, and I've had a lot of instances where I'm taken by surprise where they include that because it wasn't like written in the menu, it wasn't like actually detailed. So that's
Yeah.
what I meant about my frustrations about like dealing with dietary habits in Japan. Is like I feel like they're not clear enough sometimes when whatever's
Yeah.
included, you
I've
know.
also been to places that have had, you know, smoothies and they had like a soy smoothie. But the thing is, they put, you know, milk and soy milk in it. So just because it's a soy milk smoothie doesn't mean that it doesn't have dairy
Hmm.
in it per se. So, you know, those are things that you have to be careful of. Like it has to literally say it's vegan for it to be vegan. It just because it says it's a soy smoothie doesn't mean that it doesn't have other things in it. So I
Hmm.
think yeah, this is just a common example of, you know, culture. Whereas, you know, outside of Japan, if it said it was a soy smoothie, that's usually implying that it's a vegan item, but that might not necessarily be the case here. So just need to be a little bit careful in those instances.
Mhm. Being aware of the time, let me ask you. Let me ask you, where would you like to be with Thrive Tokyo in 5 years from now? What are your dreams? What are your wishes? What are your goals?
Oh, you know what? I'm so glad that I just decided this an hour before talking. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah. I really want to continue to help people in the different capacities that I know I can serve them. And so I think one thing I really envision is I want to be able to help either people or businesses essentially with onboarding. So I want to help people really from earlier on in their Japan journey. So ideally, as soon as someone arrives, you know, I can help with the orientation process, and then have some type of system where I can check in with them, you know, 3 months down the line, 6 months down the line, to still make sure that they're dealing well with their cultural transition. So that's something that I really see Thrive Tokyo in the next, you know, 5 years or so, is some type of onboarding platform, or a platform that allows people to reach out to me if they've been here for a couple years and they need some type of filling in of cultural gaps, or they need some type of coaching. So I actually have a platform right now called the Accelerator, and this is a pretty new platform. I basically put all of the orientation related topics that I cover into video format, and I put it into like a membership platform. So my dream would be to have kind of recurring welcome and cross-cultural training live sequences, and then people can kind of access those videos as they need it. Because if I do orientation as soon as they arrive, and like for a full day
Mm.
orientation, sometimes it's too much information too soon, and they don't necessarily need that info until maybe 3 or 6 months down the line. So this is a way that people can kind of have continued access to the resources that they need over their transition. So yeah, that would be my future goal that I'm working on right now.
Oh, thank you so
That's
much,
fantastic.
Katheryn. No, that sounds fantastic. Really, no, I wish you nothing but the best. And, thank you so much for today's really interesting conversation. A lot of what's been mentioned, I really wish I could have heard in my first year in Japan. I really wish I had something to turn to, like what you're offering here. And I hope at least someone who's tuning in today, who's, potentially going through the same or similar struggles would, at least make more sense of how to navigate the Japanese world and work environment and so forth. Where can our
And
listeners get
no,
in touch with you and, learn more
exactly,
about
yes.
what you can do for them?
Yeah, thank you guys so much. So they can check out my website. It's thrivetokyo.com. And I'm on the other social media platforms too. So if you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, it's just under my name, Katheryn Gronauer. I'm also on Instagram under Katheryn Gronauer. And yeah, I also have a Facebook page too for Thrive Tokyo. So that's kind of where you can see a lot of updates related to the business. So yeah, just come find me. I'm happy to connect you with either some resources, or if you want to work one-to-one, I'm happy to do that too.
Fantastic. And you can find all the links in the description for that. We've already included them in advance. So, yeah, you've got plenty of written works to dive into aside from Thrive Tokyo. So, do check it out. Do check out Katheryn's book on yo yo dieting as well. We had a really interesting conversation on East and West nutrition today. So, definitely would be interested to pick that up myself, actually. Have a look at those links before you go. And thank you to everyone that tuned in today. We're also one more announcement I'd like to share is actually that the show Bento Bureau, we've decided that we're going back to our roots. We're now available to stream on all podcast platforms, including Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google. So do subscribe if you haven't done so already. We really appreciate the support, and let us know if you leave us a, as Bastian's showing there, if you're on Apple especially.
Yes.
If you could leave us a review and let us know what you think, that would be fantastic as well. Expect all of our live episodes to be converted to audio, including this one, after they've been aired, and maybe some extra content that will even be exclusive to the audio show going forward. So definitely do subscribe and follow us for more. But in the meantime, that's all for now. Thank you so much, and have a lovely evening, Katheryn. Thank you so much for joining us today on Bento Bureau.
Hi, you guys. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Take care.
So, Buzz, shall we?